City. All right. So Professor Schlereth is here. Before I introduce him, oh wait, hold on. I have to give you capabilities. You have capabilities. Are you texting me? Okay, good. I like it. I like it. It is perfect. This was Professor Schlereth texting me the trivia that he's going to give you at the end. So for last week, Professor Hardesty, we've got this beautiful mug, right? This is focus slavery in Boston. So on the front, it is the grave of Frank, a slave or euphemistically servant to John Hancock. And on the back is a slave grave from the Cambridge burial ground. Very, very nice. And the question was, where in Boston, which graveyard or cemetery, burial ground, whatever you want to call it, in Boston, can you find thousands of unmarked slave graves? And there were 3 correct answers: Julia Ferrante, Justin McLennan, and Hunter Rodriguez. You guys got it right. What was the answer? Come on. You have to be here to give me your numbers. Justin says Cops Hill. That's correct. Julia and Hunter, are you here? Justin's going to walk away with this thing if you're not.
I'm here.
You're here? All right. Cops Hill, right? Where's Cops Hill? Do you guys know where it is? Bonus, I didn't ask that, so that's okay. It's in the North End. Maybe we'll see it on our trip. All right. So wait, Julia, are you here?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Just quiet. All right. So Julia, give me a number, 1 to 100. This is for my youngest daughter. We're going with my youngest daughter's jersey number here, and then I'm going to get out of children for jersey numbers, so I'm going to have to find something else. So 1 to 100, Julia.
42.
42. Justin?
I'm going 87.
87. Hunter?
51.
51. Wow. And the winner is bonus if you can guess the team sponsor. No, you won't get that. Boston Best Dental Implants. The number is 54. Can you see it? Hunter, you were very close. She didn't even have any games over the weekend, so I know you didn't go by to see them. All right. Hunter, I think that's the closest we've come. Within 3.
Good.
Gets the Slavery in Boston mug. Now today, since Professor Schlereth and I are old friends, I had to go all out for his mug, and of course, I have to show off to him. I have to make it clear that I'm a superior professor to him. So I made a super nice mug, right? 2-tone, first of all, 2-tone, blue and white. All right, zooming in. Professor Schlereth isn't looking. He's averting his eyes because he would have to admit that I'm a superior professor. So there's the what do you call it? Bloody help me out here. The massacre, Boston Massacre, not bloody massacre, Boston Massacre. But I'm looking at the blood coming out of that poor individual's head. And here is on the back, we've got the other engraving there, which is, right? Wasn't that, now I forgot. It's that riot, right? Wasn't it a riot of sorts? I can't hear you, Eric.
Yes, Christopher Sider. That's
yes, I knew it. I actually made this mug well in advance. So often I'm ordering them at the last minute and paying like $80 for rush delivery. But this one I made well in advance with the plan of sending it to Professor Schlereth well in advance. But on that I failed. But I did get it well in advance. But yes, no, you will be getting it though. You will be getting it. Okay, so this is the gorgeous best mug yet that you guys will compete for next week, and Professor Schlereth will get his. Okay. So if you haven't noticed my casual informality with Professor Schlereth, we are very, very close friends from graduate school. Professor Schlereth and I both went to Brandeis. He is the student of not the student, but a student of David Hackett Fisher, who's really one of the most Pulitzer Prize winning, most famous and well-respected revolutionary historians around. People may know Paul Revere's Ride, which was turned into a children's book and even a film, right?
There was some talk of a film. It never made it to the big screen. But
no, he cashed in on the rights, probably. Yeah.
He does let everyone know that was a possibility, though. So.
Yes, exactly. But they did do a children's book, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and he also has written a lot of other great books on Washington's Crossing, right?
Yeah.
And what was the one that made him famous about the hearth and?
Well, there was the big one called Albion Seed, which was a massive
right.
study of the colonial. Then he also, but in your neck of the woods, he also wrote about Samuel Day Champlain. I meant Professor Rabinovich's neck of the woods, Canada. So he took an effort at Canadian history. So he's had he covers a lot of ground in his work.
Yeah, and he's really well known and honestly a great wordsmith. Mm-hmm. He really is a wonderful writer. His books are great to read. I went through, as I was trying to make selections for this class, the revolutionary class. I read a good chunk of Paul Revere's Ride, which was really quite entertaining. It only didn't make the cut because we have so many other things to do. But I also get to share with you this. Look at that. That would be me and Professor Schlereth in graduate school. You get an extra mug, you know where that was, where you can identify where that is.
That should be the trivia quiz.
Yeah, exactly. I hope it survives COVID. I really, really do. But it's R.F. O'Sullivan's on the Cambridge Somerville line.
Yeah.
Can I upload that to Canvas? And honestly, these are awesome burgers and beers by the pitcher, which you actually cannot enjoy yet because you live in a barbaric country. But the burgers are fantastic. Yep. Cambridge Somerville line. We went there all the time. The funny thing about that place was, you students will enjoy this. We lived for a couple of years, my wife and I, basically across the street. And in this particular apartment, the laundry was in the basement and the kitchen door was one of those doors that locked from behind, right? It just automatically locked from behind. So you had to leave it open when you went downstairs. And on more than one occasion, I went down to do laundry during the day and got locked out. And my wife worked in the South Shore. And so I would go to R.F. O'Sullivan's in my flip flops and shorts in the middle of winter with a thing of laundry detergent and just sit there until my wife got home from work. So, but there it is. Professor Schlereth and I met. The most important introduction is that Professor Schlereth and I met in the first day in the very first methodologies class in the PhD program at Brandeis. And I think Professor Schlereth and I looked around the class. I think we were sitting next to each other, weren't we?
Yeah.
And I think we looked around the class and we're both drew the same conclusion, which is these people are nuts. Yeah. But this guy isn't, so I'll hang out with him.
Yeah. became a relationship of convenience at first, and then
right. I mean, well, I think our wives would say we're pretty nuts too. But by PhD in history standards, you just have to know enough of them to understand what we're talking about.
Yes.
Meanwhile, people are gonna somehow this is gonna go viral, and all of our colleagues from Brandeis are
Be very
say-
mad at us.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so now is the fun introductory part is over. It's time for official history time. And let me just introduce. This isn't pure nepotism. I wouldn't just get my friend to come talk to you, right? This is Professor Schlereth. He's an associate professor at the University of Texas at Dallas, and is really a wonderful historian of the American Revolution and the early United States. His first book is called An Age of Infidels, The Politics of Religious Controversy in the Early United States, which I have in my office. I meant to bring home so I could do the book wave, but it's at my office because I brought all my Boston-related books there. But it's a really wonderful book about how Christians and deists argued out issues about religious liberty and knowledge and truth in the public sphere in the early United States. Oh, there it is. And Professor Schlereth was sort of rescuing this significance of deism, I think, from the narrative of the early republic, which many view as sort of rooted in a sort of Christian nationalism, I guess, of some kind. Although he could talk more to it. But if you're interested in deism and you're interested in early religion in the early republic, or the early republic at all, it's really wonderful. And the book he's working on now, this was published with University of Pennsylvania Press, by the way. The book he's working on now is called Quitting the Nation. And it's about the phenomenon of expatriation from the United States in the early republic. And Eric, am I correct that you've been fielding a lot of calls lately from interested journalists who
The phone is ringing off the hook.
And then you have to say, no, it's not an instruction guide.
Yes.
This isn't a manual for how to do this now. This is a historical work, right?
And it's a framework for making choices in the present if you're thinking about leaving at this point.
And as I like to say, some of my best children are American. But so for me, I don't have to worry about I'm an expatriate here. Yeah. But this is going to be a really great book. And Professor Schlereth is today going to talk to us and tell us some awesome stories about Boston's role. Bostonians see it as their rule, but Boston's role in the American Revolution. Eric, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. I promise not to take us down too much farther down memory lane here, but since Professor Rabinovich did mention R.F. O'Sullivan's, I have one of my sort of favorite historian experiences from there, which is, he and I were there for the evening, and it was time to settle the bill. And, historians in math often don't sort of work out. And this was not high-level mathematics. This was figuring out the tip. And I remember we had a particularly challenging moment one time figuring out the tip. And so the joke was like historians are not that well versed in mathematics.
I think I was blacked out by that time. So
or it could have been many pictures. You never know. But in any case,
a good amount of drinking in graduate school too.
I blame it on something more edifying, which is our focus on the past rather than calculating the value of the present. Okay, good. Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. And I woke up at 5:30 Central Time just to get prepared for this.
Oh yes, and I failed to mention that. I'm really sorry, but yes, now he doesn't quite get the award that that Professor Hardesty does for coming in from Western Washington, but he's close. He still had to get up early with the time zone, even earlier than us. So I meant to give you additional kudos for that. Sorry, Eric.
That's accepted. Okay, so I need to share my screen. So what I thought I would do today is, let's pull up my screen here. Do I have permission to do this? There we go.
I've given you full capabilities.
Okay. Let's see. Oops. Okay. You know, I've only been teaching online for 3 months and I still haven't mastered the online teaching just yet, but you know, I'll get there eventually. So what I want to do today is talk about sort of 4, I think, themes that we can learn about the American Revolution that have a particular relevance to Boston. And the first one is, you know, the Revolutionary War itself lasts from 1775 to 1781, the final peace treaty ending the war of 1783. But after 1776, Boston is really not at the center of the American Revolution anymore. The major conflicts of the Revolutionary War are taking place first in upstate New York, then around New Jersey, and then really the war comes to an end in the southern part of the United States, in South Carolina and then Virginia. So the history of Boston in the Revolutionary era really is not so much Boston as part of the end of the Revolutionary War or as sort of central to the end of the Revolution, but it's really about events in Boston that I think precipitate the American Revolution and precipitate this move toward independence. And so the real action in Boston is not after 1776, it's before 1776. And it's in this really crucial decade in early American history between 1765 and 1776, when you see this fundamental change in sort of colonial opinion, a move toward this idea that there's really no place in the empire for the colonies that decide to declare independence in 1776. And so it's this crucial decade of 1765 to 1776 that Boston really plays such an important role. So I'll talk about, that will be one of the themes that kind of carries through my talk this morning. But I also want to give you some sense into how it is that sort of ordinary provincial people decide to join a revolutionary movement. How is it that ordinary people decide to protest acts of parliament or engage in riots or to sort of sign petitions? How is it that ordinary people become revolutionaries effectively? And I think this is an interesting question, not just for the American Revolution, but for all political revolutions, really. You know, you have leaders, but you have to have at least some ordinary people who are willing to sort of join up and adopt the revolution for themselves. And I think the book you read for this week about George Robert Twelve Hughes, I think does a really good job of explaining how it is that ordinary people would have found themselves becoming revolutionaries effectively. So I'll kind of expand on some things that Young wrote about in that book. Boston also, I think, has an interesting story to tell, and I think you maybe encountered this in the class last week, but there is an interesting story to be told about the relationship between the Revolution and slavery. And so I'll say a bit about that as it relates to Boston. And then I thought, because the reason that I'm here this morning, the reason that we're all here on Zoom rather than in person in class, is obviously the pandemic. And so I thought I would conclude today by giving you sort of a brief, sort of a story of epidemic in revolutionary Boston, because Boston had a major smallpox outbreak during 1775 and 1776 that really shaped its revolutionary history for that year. So those are the 4 themes that I'll talk about today. You may have seen this map in this course already or in other places, but this is one of the many maps of Boston that was made in the 18th century. And obviously, if you know the footprint of the modern city of Boston, 18th century Boston looked very different. So basically, the arrangement on this map is that this is effectively, north is effectively to the right of the screen, to the right of the image. That would be roughly north. Boston in the 1770s had a population of about 16,500 people. If you were on campus at Northeastern this morning, there would be more students probably on campus or near campus than would have lived in the entire town of Boston in the 1770s. So it was very much a face-to-face society in that regard. The inhabitants of Boston didn't know everyone who lived in the town, but they knew enough. They would have recognized many of the people. Of course, it was also a port city, so there were people coming and going aboard mercantile ships throughout the year. We know that about 8% of the population was Black inhabitants. Many of them were probably enslaved, a theme you also talked about last week. The census for Boston from the 1770s also shows a sizable number of indigenous people lived in Boston. by this point in the history of New England, indigenous people had sort of been largely removed to praying towns or lived farther in New England, but there were some indigenous people on the census record for Boston, which probably meant they were property owners to some extent, or at least paid a local tax in one way or another. But of course, Boston in the 18th century was principally known as a commercial city. On the other hand, Boston was in somewhat of decline by the late 18th century. It was being surpassed by Philadelphia and New York as the major colonial ports in the British Empire in North America. So Boston sort of was in a period of somewhat decline, economic decline by the 1760s and 1770s. And this in part leads to some of the tensions within Boston as the conflict develops after 1765. One thing that's also worth, I think, noting just in sort of a geographic sense is, the very narrow neck of Boston that leads into the town center. There were times when the tides were high when effectively this neck was covered and Boston became an island temporarily. So it was effectively, as one of the recent great histories of Boston describes this, it was effectively a city-state and then sometimes an island city-state if the tides were high. And so that should give you hopefully.
Sorry, Eric, but the great recent history that he's talking about, Professor Schlereth is talking about, is Mark Peterson, which you guys read a good part. Yeah, that's what you're talking about, right, Eric?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So they read a good chunk of it, and they're actually going to read some more of it, and he came to the class too.
Oh, well, there you go. So this is probably all old news to you then.
It is not at all. I'm only. It's not at all.
No, but that was.
I was just telling them who you were talking about.
Yeah, no, he's one of the very good people, a good person to have in all of this. So that just gives you some sense of Boston sort of as a place in the Revolutionary era. So now I'll spend the next few minutes talking about a series of parliamentary acts, because you can't really understand the history of revolutionary Boston without understanding Parliament's efforts during the 1760s, and this is Parliament in London, Parliament's efforts in the 1760s and 1770s to reform the empire. And this was the main sort of ambition of Parliament after the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. This was a major colonial conflict that actually, pushed the French out of North America, expanded the size of Great Britain's North American empire by double. And so effectively, just to summarize sort of a long history that precedes this, is that during the 1760s and 1770s, Parliament wanted to find ways to effectively reform the British Empire, to raise revenue, to support the empire, to make sort of questions of sovereignty and jurisdiction, clarify those, the relationship between Parliament and the colonies. And so as part of this larger history, Parliament adopts a series of acts to raise revenue in North America. And so I'll just give you a brief introduction to some of these acts and then describe how Bostonians went about responding to this. And perhaps the first and most important of these was known as the Stamp Act. This was a revenue-raising act adopted in 1765. The idea would be that any official piece of paper, be a will, newspapers, playing cards, any newspapers, any document that would be sold or used for a legal purpose would have to have a stamp affixed to it. And the way to get this stamp would be by paying a small tax or a fee. And so the idea was that by imposing this Stamp Act in the colonies, this would be an easy way to raise revenue that was perfectly in line with how revenue was raised in England. There were stamp taxes adopted in England as well. Well, this raises questions in the colonies because you begin to have an argument emerge that Parliament cannot introduce taxes in the colonies. Only the local colonial assemblies can raise taxes. And so this is where you begin to have this argument of questions about taxation versus representation, this kind of classic political argument. The idea was that if Parliament were to impose taxes in the colonies, this would reflect a violation of the colonists' British liberties. They often spoke in terms of the British liberties because they had no idea that they would be anything but British people the rest of their lives. And so you begin to see protests erupt in places like Boston in 1765, as soon as word of the Stamp Act makes its way across the Atlantic. And information in the 18th century, it would take upwards of sometimes 6 weeks to 3 months for information to make it from London to a port like Boston. So by our standards, right, I mean, information traveled very slowly. And this creates a lot of interesting kind of historical, they're not really misunderstandings because there is no other way of knowing otherwise, but we can see how history could have turned out differently at key points if information had traveled more quickly in the 18th century. But in any case, information was making its way back and forth across the Atlantic in a fairly long delay. But as soon as word of the Stamp Act makes it to Boston, you suddenly see protests in the streets of Boston. There's a group that organizes known as they called themselves the Loyal Nine. They were a group, they were based in a tavern club. Taverns become important sites of political mobilization, not just drinking and socializing, but sites of political mobilization in the 18th century. Many the members of the so-called Loyal Nine were described in the local press as men of standing. That's an 18th century way of saying that they were not sort of artisans or sailors or people who were viewed at the lower ranks of the social order, but they were considered respectable people. And so under the sort of leadership of this group of men known as the Loyal Nine, they established a Liberty Tree in Boston, which is, maybe you'll see this on a tour, or the location of this Liberty Tree, which is basically in where Chinatown is now. So there's a Liberty Tree that's sort of declared in Boston. The local person who was charged with enforcing the Stamp Act, Andrew Oliver, was hung in effigy. So the Loyal Nine hangs this man in effigy from the Liberty Tree. They go about destroying the buildings they thought were going to be used to enforce the Stamp Act. They vandalized Andrew Oliver's home. And under all this pressure, Andrew Oliver resigns. He gets the message that he is not going to, that the Stamp Act is probably unenforceable and he's not going to attempt to enforce it out of risk to his life. And so due to protests in Boston, as I think Alfred Young also described in his book, some of this property destruction was directed at the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts at the time, a guy named Thomas Hutchinson. And so effectively what happens is through protests in Boston first, and then other colonial ports, the Stamp Act effectively becomes unenforceable in North America. And through this series of popular protests, this effort by Parliament to raise revenue in the colonies collapses. And by 1766, Parliament has declared it will not attempt to enforce the Stamp Act, and they repeal the Stamp Act. And so this first wave of colonial protest proved successful. But it was in Boston where the protests really started first. Boston kind of led the movement in this direction. And then, of course, there were colonial papers that were very active, and colonial editors spread information about the Boston protests throughout the colonies, and this then inspires protest elsewhere. And so I think this is a good example of events in Boston sort of precipitating a move towards stronger opposition to Parliament. Also in the wake of the Stamp Act, you see the formation of groups known as the Sons of Liberty emerge throughout the colonies. These are also the same kind of men who joined the Loyal Nine also formed these Sons of Liberty organizations, and they really took it upon themselves to sort of mobilize protest against Parliament. So the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766. Parliament takes a new effort to raise revenue in 1767 with something known as the Townshend Acts. And I can, if anyone's interested in some of the more sort of the details of these parliamentary acts, I can talk about that in the question time. But just for our purposes now, the Townshend Acts were a series of acts to also try and raise more revenue in the colonies and to sort of create stronger enforcement of these revenue-raising mechanisms in the colonies. Well, this then provokes a whole new wave of protest in the colonies. And again, Boston's in the front of this. The Sons of Liberty in Boston organized protests almost instantly to the Townshend Acts as soon as news makes its way to the colonies. But what's interesting in response to the Townshend Acts is you see a new form of protest become much more common in the colonies, and that's tarring and feathering. And so I thought I would spend sort of, Young mentions tarring and feathering, but I thought I would walk you through what the process was like in the 18th century to be tarred and feathered. It was actually a fairly brutal process. It was not anything to be taken lightly. And so the way this process would typically be would carry out, and I had my notes on this, and I set them down, and now I can't find them. I was so excited about the mug that Professor Rabinovich made for me. I misplaced my notes on tarring and feathering.
Take your time. Take your time. We can all just sort of take this time to contemplate.
Well, contemplation time is over, unless we need more time, because I found my
No,
notes.
I contemplate, like, do some sort of mental role playing about what it is to be tarred and feathered.
Yeah, so this is one of the classic depictions of a tarring and feathering. And a few things about this image. The man on the right has this bow in his hair. That's an indication that he's a member of the Sons of Liberty. This 45 on the hat it refers to a political protest from England at about the same time. So there's a lot of rich imagery that not just is about provincial politics, but about metropolitan politics in England as well. And it's just a reminder that these people in the colonies really viewed themselves as part of this broader imperial political moment. They didn't view themselves only as sort of provincials, but they were becoming more and more identified with imperial politics. But in any case, tarring and feathering becomes much more common as a form of protest in response to the Townshend Act. It was almost always directed toward people who were either viewed as sympathetic to the Townshend Acts or would potentially have some role in enforcing the Townshend Acts. So if you were tarred and feathered in the 1760s and 1770s, you were often someone who was viewed as an enemy to the British liberties of the provincials by attempting to enforce the Townshend Acts. Those who did the tarring and feathering, those who led these were these Sons of Liberty groups, other self-proclaimed liberty movements that were forming in the colonies at the time. They are the ones who would engage in the tarring and feathering. Of course, the two key ingredients of tarring and feathering was pine tar and feathers. Both of those were in great abundance in places like Boston. Pine tar was used for shipbuilding, ship repair, because Boston was a port city. There was plenty of pine tar at hand on the docks and wharfs of Boston. And there was also plenty of feathers, because even though Boston was a port city, it was still, people lived much more closer to an agricultural life than we do today. And they would have had chickens and geese, and there would have been feathers available throughout Boston. So the two key ingredients of the tarring and feathering were in abundance in Boston. And if a group were to seize a person to tar and feather him, there was a pretty sort of clear process they would follow. The first thing they would do is they would often strip off their shirt, if not most of their clothing. And then in order for the tar to be pliable, it had to be hot. They had to heat the tar. So sometimes they would take the person and actually dunk him into a barrel of hot tar. In other cases, they would paint the tar on with a brush. Often they would hold the person down to the ground to do this, because obviously no one is going to sort of passively stand by to have hot tar painted on their body or dipped into a bucket of hot tar. After they were then dipped in the tar or painted with the tar, they would then have the feathers poured over them. We know in one case in Salem, Massachusetts, a man was tarred and feathered, but he was tarred first, held to the ground, and the townspeople pummeled him with a live goose. So I've always tried to envision what this must have looked like for this poor fellow, and the poor goose, I should add. I mean, what in the world was going through this must have been going through this goose's mind as this crowd was holding this man down and pummeling him with a live goose. As far as we know, that's the only incident of using a live bird, if you will, or a live fowl. I'm not sure the proper language for this, but instead of pouring feathers on the person, using the feathers that were still attached to the goose or the chicken to pummel the man.
Except for at an Ozzy Osbourne concert. But that
would be a bat, though, right? Didn't he bite the head off a bat? Which has a whole new sort of like,
too.
Yeah, but as someone who loves Ozzy Osbourne, I should know more about the archive of Ozzy Osbourne's animal cruelty, but I don't. After the person was tarred, and after the person was covered in the coat of tar, covered in feathers, in some cases they would be left outside. So there was a case in Boston in January of 1774, and you know what a Boston winter is like, presumably. This man was tarred and feathered, left outside in Boston in the middle of winter. He suffered severe frostbite, and when he tried to eventually remove the tar from his hands and feet. He wound up ripping off all of the sort of the dead and dying flesh from the frostbite. Even if you weren't left out in the middle of winter to suffer frostbite, the process of removing the tar would often rip skin off, cause all sorts of rashes. So your ordeal wasn't over when the tarring and feathering ended. You would have to get the tar and feathers off of you, and this was a very painful process. To take us a bit farther afield from Boston, there was a person who was tarred and feathered in Norfolk, Virginia. After he was coated in tar and feathers, he was tossed into the harbor, and then the crowd threw stones at him while he was bobbing and trying to stay afloat. And imagine having your body covered in a layer of tar and feathers and then trying to stay afloat in a harbor. That would be a pretty challenging act of swimming. And then to have the townspeople throwing stones at you in the process. They fished him out before he drowned. But in any case, the reason I go into, I think this is an interesting part of the protest movement, but it also shows you how, I think there's sometimes an image of the American Revolution in particular as this sort of kind of clear conflict between people defending liberty against a tyrannical empire. But of course, we know most events in history are not that neat and tidy. And the revolution, or the buildup to the American Revolution, was also about coercion and about sort of forcing people to adopt certain ideas, discouraging support for other ideas. And it really begins to take on all the features of a civil war more than anything else once the conflict begins. But even in the buildup to this, you see factions emerging within colonial society. And tarring and feathering was a great way to send a message to your neighbors who you thought were on the wrong side of this political debate. A bit more about the process of tarring and feathering. Often after you were tarred and feathered, you'd be put into a cart and then wheeled through the town, through the streets of your town. Onlookers might hurl insults at you or objects at you as you were being carted through the street. The cart would often make stops before sort of symbolic parts in places in the town. They might stop in front of the Liberty Tree, sending a very clear message that you've been tarred and feathered because you're violating the liberties of your fellow townspeople. Often the cart would stop in front of the whipping post, the town whipping post. If there were people who were suspected of informing against smugglers or informing against those who were violating the Townshend Acts, they might stop the cart with the tarred and feathered person in front of that person's house. So imagine to look out your window and to see your neighbors staring at you with a tarred and feathered person in a cart. That would send a pretty clear message that you should probably change your behavior.
Eric, can I just, there's a very good question in the chat, if I could ask it on behalf of the student. Did this sort of take on the spectacle of entertainment, like a town sporting event? Was there an entertainment element to this?
It seems so. There aren't really any firsthand accounts of people saying I went there for the thrill of it all, but it's probably pretty. I mean, it seems plausible that there were some who were doing this because they were deeply committed to challenging Parliament's oversight or sort of overreach. But the crowds were large enough that, and we know enough sort of about kind of crowd behavior today, that there certainly were people who were there for entertainment. And in fact, those who were tarred and feathered, though, were often mocked in the press. So that does suggest that there's this braiding of kind of political protest with spectacle and with entertainment, because they became, and these images, I mean, clearly this is not really an image, I don't think, that's sympathetic to the person who's tarred and feathered. This is not an effort to sort of engender support for the person who's tarred and feathered. This is, in fact, I think, more of a mocking image, I would think. So yeah, I think there was an element of entertainment to this, and an element that this was spectacle. And that's actually, the question is, I like the question because it kind of segues to the last point I was going to make about this, which is, how is it that ordinary people become participants in a broader revolutionary movement? You could participate in a tarring and feathering if you didn't have the wealth or standing to vote. There were no sort of property requirements to participate in a tarring and feathering. You could be a young person. We know that children, the image on the other side of the mug, the murder of Christopher Sider, that happens because a group of boys, in Boston, Market Day was a school holiday, so every Thursday kids weren't in school. And so Christopher Sider and these other 10 and 11-year-old boys protest outside of a merchant's shop, and that's how the incident actually happens. But we know that children were in the audience for tarring and feathering. And so you didn't have to be a person who came from the traditional standing for political power in the colonies to participate in the tarring and feathering. It was a way of engaging in political protest and sort of expanding the scope of political protest beyond what was considered those people who were supposed to hold power in the colonies. It was an expansion of sort of claims to political rights. But the flip side of this is people were probably also there just for the spectacle of it all, and it was entertainment. So I think these two things are not really in conflict, but you can see both of them taking place. If you're interested in this subject, there are a lot of articles that have been written about tarring and feathering that in the question and answer period, I can put some of those into the chat, or I can send those to Professor Rabinovich and he can share those citations with you. So that's sort of this, I think after the Townshend Acts, tarring and feathering becomes more common. And it also speaks to how it is that ordinary people became participants in the revolution. Back to this theme of Boston as precipitating events in the revolution. It's in the aftermath of protests to the Townshend Acts in Boston that Parliament decides that the colonies are beginning to become troublesome, but it's Boston as the place that's the most problematic. By the late 1760s, officials in London are growing more and more concerned about Boston as a place of particular trouble for the empire. And one of the things they do in part to respond to this is they deploy several thousand British regulars to Boston. And you may have seen this image in some of your earlier readings, but this is the very well-known Paul Revere image of the British regulars deploying in Boston in 1768. And this also causes a lot of problems in Boston because if you remember, I mentioned early on, Boston was sort of suffering a kind of a long economic malaise, a term that we would use in the 21st century. And one of the things that happens is these Boston regulars that were stationed, they would often seek part-time work effectively in Boston. So they're there under the orders of Parliament, but they began to seek effectively side jobs or extra jobs in Boston. So they're competing in the labor pool with the local men. And this caused a lot of tension in Boston as well. And in some ways, this creates the conditions for the murder of Christopher Sider in February of 1770, but then also creates the conditions for the more well-known Boston Massacre in March of 1770. I didn't plan to go into those two events in much detail today, just because I think Young covers them pretty well. But again, if there's any questions about the specifics of Christopher Sider or the Boston Massacre, I'd be happy to talk about that in the question and answer period. I'm just trying to get us sort of up to 1775 and 76. But these two events in winter of 1770, the murder of Christopher Sider and then the Boston Massacre, really go far in turning popular opinion in Boston, at least, against the presence of these British regulars that are stationed in the town. And word of both of these events does spread throughout the other colonies. One of the other developments that happens in this period is the creation of committees of correspondence. You see early committees of correspondence come into place. And these are effectively just self-created groups of colonists that go about sharing information about what Parliament is doing, what Parliament's representatives in the colonies are doing, what imperial officials are doing. And so word through these communication networks spreads throughout the colonies about the Christopher Sider incident and the Boston Massacre in March of 1770. Boston remains sort of a place of simmering turmoil throughout after 1770. But this then comes to a head again in 1773 with another effort by Parliament, in this case, not really to raise revenue, but to effectively bail out the East India Company. And of course, this is what becomes known as the destruction of the tea, or the Boston Tea Party. So in 1773, Parliament adopts what's known as the Tea Act. And this was, as I said, really mainly an effort to help prop up the East India Company, which was a major trading company based in London that effectively governed parts of India. And it had sort of a major role in supplying the empire with tea, which drinking tea by this point was not only a practice of elites within English and colonial society, but had become common throughout colonial society as well. And so tea drinking is a common practice. If the East India Company were to founder and effectively go under, this would have a major impact on the colonial economy. And so Parliament takes steps to effectively create or guarantee a monopoly for East India tea in the colonies. And this then raises a whole new series of protests because it seemed in part that this was British favoritism toward a mercantile company, not the interests of the colonists. It also raised all these simmering debates about Parliament's jurisdiction over the colonies as well. And so in response to the Tea Act, a whole new series of protests emerges. I'll just go back to the tarred and feathering image for a moment. You'll notice he's holding a teapot. The man on the left of the image is holding a teapot. Tarred and feathering becomes even more common after the Tea Act as well. And often the images that you see of tarred and feathering after this period depict in some way or another forcing tea down the person's throat who's been tarred and feathered. The protests to the Tea Act are effective in every colonial port except for Boston. Boston effectively becomes a place where there's a standoff between local colonial officials and the townspeople, in part because some of the local colonial officials are invested effectively in the East India Company and are going to be, will benefit from enforcing the Tea Act. And so Boston becomes a place where there's a real standoff between this effort to enforce the Tea Act and the protests against the Tea Act. In every other colonial port, the Tea Act is not even close to going into effect because the protests are so effective. But in Boston, you wind up effectively with this standoff in the winter of 1773 as these East India ships are anchored in the harbor loaded with East India tea, but the townspeople are taking efforts to prevent this tea from being unloaded. This is an image that you probably saw in the Alfred Young book. This is actually from 1846. Another good piece of trivia could be, what is the historical inaccuracy in this image? And since that's not the question that I gave Professor Rabinovich, I'll point it out. We know that the people who observed this from the docks were not cheering when this happened. We know that most of those on the docks that watched the destruction of the tea take place stood there mostly in silence. It was not a sort of a raucous affair as depicted in this image. But in any case, this I like this image from 1846, and it's a commonly used image because it captures a few themes of the Boston Tea Party, which is it gives you a pretty good indication of sort of what the event would have looked like with the chests of tea being dumped into the harbor. But it also shows the people who did this dressed as Mohawk Indians. And this is a sort of interesting part of colonial culture in the sense that there was sort of deep antipathy and violence often directed toward indigenous people in the colonial period. But then in other instances, especially in moments of political protest, it was quite common for these colonists to adopt effectively an indigenous identity, what one scholar has called, they played Indian in this. And they viewed sort of indigenous people as sort of symbols of kind of a native liberty, as they would describe it. And so the iconography of indigenous people played sort of a complicated role in the colonial protests. And I think you see that at work in this image. Again, I'm not going to go through all of the details that kind of walks us through the Tea Party because Young does that, I think so well. But what happens is because of the Tea Party in Boston, Parliament takes even more forceful efforts to kind of control Boston as the center of protest and try and rein Boston in from going too far down this road of challenging parliamentary authority. But before I talk about that, I do want to point out that there were effectively tea parties in other parts of the colonies. We know so much about the Boston Tea Party, but there were other acts of destroying tea throughout the colonies. Just sort of down the road from where you are in Weston, Massachusetts, there's a place called the Golden Ball Tavern. The owner of the Golden Ball Tavern had some East India tea in his possession, and he planned to use that tea. He had no interest in doing anything about this East India tea, even though now there was a protest against the company. Well, the people of Weston had a different idea, and local men in Weston, Massachusetts, also dressed as Mohawk Indians, storm into the Golden Ball Tavern. They destroy the tavern's store of tea, and then they print the tavern keeper's name in the newspaper as an enemy of the British liberties of the people. And so imagine this, that you're this tavern keeper at the Golden Ball Tavern. Not only is your supply of tea destroyed, but your name has now been published in the newspaper by name as an enemy of the British liberties of the people of Massachusetts. And again, this was another effort to coerce people into supporting a political cause. The students at the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University, they protest and destroy the college's storehouse of tea. In Annapolis, Maryland, the person who was charged with distributing East India tea in Annapolis, Maryland was named Anthony Stewart. The protesters in Annapolis threatened to kill him and his family if he were to distribute East India tea. He decided not to do that, but they still destroyed his ship, and they burned one of his ships to the hull in the water at Annapolis, Maryland. And so what happens is these protests to the Tea Act spread throughout the colonies, but it's the one in Boston that gained the most notoriety. One more sort of minor feature about this, to give you a window into how colonial protest could spread to groups of people who weren't expected to have political ideas or political views based on their identity. Women begin to brew something known as Labrador tea in response to the Tea Act. So rather than brewing tea from imported tea leaves, they begin to brew a tea that was called Labrador tea, and was made out of local plants and roots. And by all accounts, it looked terrible, it tasted disgusting, but you would drink your Labrador tea as a way of protesting the Tea Act. And I mention this because this is a way in which we know that women became involved in the protest movement as well. Women in colonial society had virtually no legal rights that we would recognize today. There were laws that effectively wrapped their legal identity into the identity of their husbands. But this was a way in which women could participate in the colonial protest movement that were acceptable to sort of the gender norms of the day. Brewing tea and making choices about consumption were choices that women made often in their daily lives for their families. And so by brewing Labrador tea in protest to the Tea Act, this was a way in which women became participants in the revolutionary movement as well. And in fact, we also know groups of women formed Daughters of Liberty organizations as well. And Boston was home to several Daughters of Liberty organizations for women who found ways to protest Parliament in ways that were acceptable to what were considered the gendered norms of the day. Well, in response to the Tea Act and in response to the destruction of the tea in Boston, Parliament also imposes a harsher set of measures on Massachusetts and Boston in particular. In Parliament, these were known as the Coercive Acts. In the colonies in Boston in particular, they became known as the Intolerable Acts. And this is an image depicting a colonial perspective on the Coercive Acts. Effectively, what these were is that Parliament takes several steps to really rein in control over Boston. They closed the port of Boston to all trade except for shipments of food and fuel. So Boston was put under a naval blockade in 1774, which was a major hit to the city because, of course, Boston was an international port. The British Navy shuts Boston down in 1774 as punishment for the Tea Act. It revises the Massachusetts Charter so that elected offices are now appointed. It puts the power of taxation into the governor, away from the assemblies. And again, I'll just summarize because I want to make sure I get through the rest here. Class ends at what, 9:40 your time?
Yeah.
Okay. Effectively, what Parliament does with the Coercive Acts is attempts to punish Boston, to separate Boston from the rest of the colonies, and to separate, in some ways, Boston from Massachusetts. There was an effort to kind of alienate Boston from the rest of the colony, and to punish the townspeople of Boston for participating in the destruction of the tea. So the idea was to identify Boston as the problem, separate Boston and separate Massachusetts from the rest of the colonies, make the rest of the colonies effectively turn against Boston. But the opposite happens. Rather than turning against Massachusetts and Boston, Sons of Liberty organizations throughout the colonies rally around the cause of Boston. And so by the spring and summer of 1774, the Coercive Acts become a real sort of crystallizing moment in colonial protest. It's in the wake of this that you see real popular sentiment in other colonies mobilize around the cause of Boston, and Boston becomes in some ways a symbol of what Parliament might do if it decides to really enforce its trade policies and clamp down on the colonies. And so the Coercive Acts have the opposite effect that Parliament had intended. Rather than alienating the people of Boston from the rest of the colonies, they wind up, in fact, gaining more support for Boston in the rest of the colonies. And what this image depicts various members of Parliament and the imperial administration in London effectively holding down a woman who symbolizes the colonies. They're forcing tea down her throat, and they're basically, and then the woman in the background whose eyes are covered, that is the symbol of Great Britain, sort of averting her eyes, that she can't believe what these agents of Parliament are doing to her loyal subjects in the colonies. And so this image is sort of very rich in a lot of the main political debates, because there was a view in the colonies that it wasn't the king who was the problem in all of this. It wasn't the king who was threatening the liberties of his subjects in the empire. It wasn't the sort of royal state. It was, in fact, rogue agents in Parliament. It was these colonial administrators who'd taken on too much power that were threatening the liberties of the colonists, not the king. And so I think this captures that idea that it's Parliament that's the problem here, not monarchy or not the royal state, effectively. And so this image in opposition to the Coercive Acts circulates throughout the colonies, and you can see it's titled "The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Draw." And this is a protest to the Coercive Acts as this real fundamental threat, not just to the liberties of Boston and Massachusetts, but to the colonies more broadly. And it's really in 1774, in response to this, that you see a whole new wave of a new level of organization in response to Parliament take root in the colonies. And this is with the convening of the Continental Congress in September of 1774. Delegates from almost all the colonies meet in Philadelphia in September of 1774 with the main goal of deciding how the colonies should respond to the Coercive Acts. That was the main goal of this meeting. It was organized under the appeal of the Massachusetts Sons of Liberty. So the leaders of the protest movement in Massachusetts called for some colonial-wide assembly. Again, this is not recognized by Parliament, not recognized by official government in the colonies. This is a sort of created convention, if you will. And so the Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia in September of 1774 with the specific goal of deciding how should the colonists challenge the Coercive Acts, challenge the Intolerable Acts as they were known. And they do so, they agree on basically forming a non-importation, non-exportation agreement. So basically the colonists decide to use their power as consumers, because by this point they're buying a lot of items from imperial merchants and from other parts of the empire. And so the idea was that they can stop importing all goods from other parts of the empire, stop exporting goods to the empire. They can effectively bring the imperial economy to a standstill. And so they knew this could work in part because often when we talk about the American Revolution, we forget there weren't just 13 British colonies, there were actually 26 British colonies. The other half of the empire was just primarily located in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean empire was an empire that was based on enslaved labor and sugar cultivation. Parts of the Caribbean empire, 90% of the population were enslaved people. And so one of the tactics of this non-importation, non-exportation agreement was to actually put pressure on these other colonies in the empire. Because if you can cut off food supply to a slave colony, you really raise the prospects of a slave rebellion. Enslaved people were always willing to find ways to resist their enslavement. And if you can basically create effectively a famine in a slave colony, you can cause that, you can help bring about a slave rebellion. So this non-importation, non-exportation effort was not only a goal to put pressure on Parliament, but it was also in some ways an effort to sort of mobilize some of these other colonies to perhaps support the cause of the mainland. And so there was a real effort to get some of these Caribbean colonies to actually join the protest movement. It didn't happen in most cases because the colonists in places like Barbados and Jamaica realized they needed Parliament to protect them from slave rebellions more than they could protest Parliament.
Eric,
In any
quick
case-
question. Sorry,
Sure.
quick question just from the chat on a clarification.
Yeah.
There's a question: is there a difference between the Sons of Boston Sons of Liberty and the Massachusetts Sons of Liberty, or are these one and the same?
Oh, no, sorry. So no, they are, what happens is Sons of Liberty form in towns in Massachusetts effectively. So there wasn't one group called the Massachusetts Sons of Liberty. There was the Boston Sons of Liberty, and then there would have been Sons of Liberty organizations in other Massachusetts towns.
Various locally based Sons of Liberty.
Various locally based, yeah. Virtually none of these movements they didn't identify with particular colonies often. They would identify with, so there's the New York Sons of Liberty, the Philadelphia Sons of Liberty, the Albany Sons of Liberty in that context. So yeah, they were locally created. And that's also a function of the fact that so much of colonial governance was local in that regard. And so they kind of built on that local foundation of governance. But yeah, good question. There was no group really known as the Massachusetts Sons of Liberty. They were the Boston Sons of Liberty. And so there's this effort to sort of bring the imperial economy to a standstill, to put pressure on Parliament to repeal the Coercive Acts. And the last thing I'll mention about this before going to the third theme I wanted to talk about today, which is enslavement and revolution. What happens by 1774, and I think actually the question that was just posed is a nice kind of segue to this. What's happening by 1774 is that effectively local sovereignty in the colonies by 1774 is slowly slipping out of the hands of those recognized colonial governments and out of any jurisdiction from Parliament and into the hands of groups like the Sons of Liberty and these committees of correspondence that often overlap with the Sons of Liberty. And so what's happening by 1774 in the colonies is that you begin to see this process of sovereignty effectively leaving parliamentary recognized forms of government and into these revolutionary governments effectively. I mean, they haven't declared independence yet, but these are protest movements that are adopting the functions of sovereignty for their own purposes. We know, for example, that that some of these Sons of Liberty groups begin to effectively take control of taxation policy in local communities. They begin to have some say over mustering the militia. So these Sons of Liberty, in coordination with these known as committees of safety, they begin to effectively exercise local sovereignty in the colonies. And again, this might seem like a subtle change, but it marks a really dramatic shift in political authority in the colonies. Once you begin to have these self-proclaimed groups of people professing to possess sovereignty and behaving in sovereign ways, that doesn't bode well for the future of parliamentary jurisdiction over these colonies. And so this is a key, I think it's one of these subtle but key moments of change in the protest movement once you have these groups begin to claim local sovereignty for themselves. And again, I can say more about, I know there's a lot of overlapping groups here, and I can say more about that in the questions if need be. The third theme I wanted to mention that I think Boston can tell us something about as well, which is, revolutions have a way of unleashing ideas that take on a life of their own, beyond what the authors of these ideas or the proponents of these ideas had in mind. And this is especially evident in the history of slavery in Boston. As you know from class last week, Boston was very much part of the Atlantic slave economy. For a long time, historians in New England really didn't say much about racial slavery. That's been one of the really sort of, I think, changes in this historiography, is that we now know that not just Boston, but New England was part of the Atlantic slave economy just as much as the rest of the empire was. And in some places, Southern Rhode Island, for example, had a percentage of enslaved population that would have rivaled some of the Southern colonies. The Connecticut River Valley was heavily invested in enslaved labor. So racial slavery was part of New England from the very beginning. And it wasn't just the enslavement of African people as well. There was also indigenous enslavement as well. But what happens in Boston is that between 1773 and 1777, as you may have encountered last week, there's a series of slave petitions put forward to first the colonial officials and then to the new sort of independent state government after 1776. And if you read these petitions in sort of chronological order, if you read them from 1773 to 1777, you can effectively witness the sort of creation of a sort of a political claim by enslaved people. And this is, I mean, this sort of cuts to the heart of the contradictions of racial slavery, right? Because the whole sort of justification for racial slavery is reducing people to property in the eyes of the law. Well, once you have enslaved people writing petitions, making political claims of their own, demanding political rights, that reveals this contradiction of slavery in fundamental ways. The law might describe enslaved people as property without agency in that regard, but we know from all sorts of evidence that enslaved people exercised a great deal of agency. And we see this take place in Boston. And as far as I know, Boston was the first sort of place where you have actual petitions from enslaved people in the Revolutionary era, sort of demanding some of their rights. And I just put this quote up here on the screen because I think it's worth taking a look at briefly, because it captures what was at the heart of these petitions from enslaved people in Boston between 1773 and 1777. And what I think is interesting about this is that they talk about a natural and an inalienable, it's a hard word to say aloud, unalienable, a natural and unalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of the universe hath bestowed equally on all mankind. And so this is a claim to universal rights. It's a claim to the same sorts of rights that were expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson did not intend for enslaved people to proclaim unalienable rights for themselves as a slave owner himself. But here in Boston, you see enslaved people making these claims. And this is actually 2 years before the Declaration of Independence, but this language was circulating throughout the colonies. And so I think these petitions in Boston are sort of a great example into what was unique about sort of the question of slavery and the revolution in Boston. You actually see enslaved people making demands for their own liberty. We know that, well, by 1784, slavery was outlawed in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts outlawed slavery much earlier than almost any other place in North America, except for Vermont. Vermont was an independent republic. And Vermont, in its independent Constitution of 1777, outlawed slavery. But in terms of those states that were part of the original United States, Massachusetts was the first to outlaw slavery. And I think it speaks to this earlier history of enslaved people adopting this revolutionary moment of their own and protesting for their rights. And we also know that in other colonies, enslaved people took the opportunity during the revolution to flee and gain their seek liberty within the empire. For most enslaved people, freedom did not mean the United States, freedom meant the empire. And there's this fascinating history of former slaves from North America finding themselves in places like Nova Scotia, in Sierra Leone in West Africa, in Australia. Some of the earliest non-Indigenous Australian inhabitants were people who were born enslaved in North America. It's just a sort of fascinating global history of the revolution. This effectively diaspora of formerly enslaved people in North America who make their way to the far reaches of the British Empire. Okay. Again, if there's any questions, further questions about enslavement and the revolution in Boston, I'd be happy to talk about that as well. The last thing I'll talk about is the relationship between epidemic disease and the revolution in Boston. So the real military action in Boston happens for about a year between 1775 and 1776. And this is known as the Siege of Boston. Basically, what happens during the siege of Boston is that the town itself is occupied by British forces, by British regulars. Many of the townspeople fled if they could, but many of them stayed. And so for about a year, 6,000 to 7,000 townspeople of Boston lived in Boston. Some of them were loyalists, people who were sympathetic to the crown, but there were just ordinary Bostonians who didn't leave for whatever reason, who often couldn't leave. This is a sort of pattern you see everywhere. Those with the least means can't leave, and so they have to stay and suffer through whatever conditions are presented to them. But between 1775 and 1776, Boston is effectively under the control of British regular forces and a general named William Howe. If you look on this map, so basically, obviously, here's Boston. If you can follow my cursor, here's Boston in the center. Here's that narrow neck that would sometimes flood during high tide. This to the north is Charlestown, and then over here to the left is Cambridge. And here's the Charles River through here. So during the siege of Boston, you have George Washington in command of the newly created Continental Army, basically stationed in Cambridge. And here's the center of Cambridge. Harvard University is right in this general area. So it's George Washington in command of the Continental Army, along with militia units from all over New England, are stationed, and some from Pennsylvania, are stationed in Cambridge. British regulars are in control of Boston. And effectively, by the summer of 1775, there's a stalemate. There are periodic skirmishes, but it's basically there's no military momentum. There's no momentum forward in solving this conflict. And it's in the middle of this political stalemate that you have a major outbreak of smallpox in this town of Boston. And if you know anything about smallpox, number one, it was a very common disease throughout sort of the colonial period and even the pre-colonial period in Europe. With the advent of colonization, smallpox decimated the indigenous population of the Western Hemisphere. Best accounts we have, in some places, 90% of indigenous people died, and they died in large part because of smallpox, because there was no immunity within the indigenous peoples of North and South America against the smallpox. And it's a disease that it spreads very quickly. It spreads much more effectively, for example, than we think COVID does today. And its hallmark was severe pocking, and in particular on the face. And if any person survived smallpox, they would often have fairly severe scarring on the face. For whatever reason, the disease settles on that part of the body. And so people were familiar with smallpox. It wasn't a new disease by 1775. There had been smallpox epidemics in Boston's history before this. There were early efforts at effectively an inoculation where you would take pus from one of the pustules and rub that into the skin of a non-infected person, effectively hoping to give them a mild form of smallpox. It raised all sorts of controversies about whether this was safe or not. So sort of modern debates over if vaccines are safe have their history, like everything does. You know, one thing that I think probably Professor Epidemics and I love to tell our students is that everything has a history. Everything around us has a history. That we live in this world based on this earlier history. But in any case, I won't go down that road today. But smallpox settles in Boston in 1775. And it settles into the ranks of the British regulars that were stationed there. Here's how one woman in Boston described the health of the British regulars. It is said that they are very sickly. The putrid fever, smallpox, and dysentery prevail among them. It is said that they are very sickly. The putrid fever, smallpox, and dysentery prevail among them. And just to sort of take you into the kind of gory details of dysentery, the sort of main symptom of dysentery is bloody diarrhea. So they often called it the bloody flux in the 18th century. And so the troops in Boston are not only suffering from smallpox, but also dysentery. The British general in command of these forces introduces an inoculation program for his soldiers, also introduces quarantine for the sick. And so they're taking all of these steps to try and prevent the spread of smallpox in Boston among the British regulars. General Howe, the British commander of Boston, was convinced that, in fact, this prevented the Continental Army from invading Boston because they were afraid of catching smallpox, which in fact we know they were. George Washington was deeply concerned about smallpox spreading through his soldiers. He also took steps to inoculate some of the soldiers under his command into quarantine. Abigail Adams the wife of future President John Adams, who witnessed the siege of Boston from the outside. This is what she had to say. The desolation of war is not so distressing as the havoc made by the pestilence. The desolation of war is not so distressing as the havoc made by the pestilence. So at least from Abigail Adams' perspective, smallpox was far more problematic and troubling than the siege of Boston. As the siege continues, the smallpox continues to spread. General Howe allows some people to leave Boston, and as soon as they leave Boston, they begin to spread smallpox in the communities where they arrive. Rumors begin to spread through the colonial press that this was an act effectively of germ warfare, that Howe let these people leave knowing they would spread smallpox to the neighboring communities, often comprised of people who were hostile to Parliament and the British presence. We don't know if this is what Howe intended, but it had that effect. Smallpox begins to spread to the neighboring communities outside of Boston. Finally, the siege comes to an end in 1776 when the Continental Army sort of mounts cannon all over Dorchester Heights in this area down here. And at that point, Boston was lost to the British. The Boston evacuate, still celebrate Evacuation Day in Boston to this day. But in any case, by the spring of 1776, the British regulars and all their sympathizers have left Boston. And so by the spring of 1776, Boston is back in the hands of patriots, effectively, or Whigs, as they called them. But they were very cautious about re-entering the city for fear of smallpox. And in fact, Washington selects soldiers who'd already had the disease to go into Boston first, because they would have had the immunity. And so basically the first of these Continental and militia soldiers to enter Boston are those that have already had smallpox. They had to sort of determine if it was safe for other people to return. And what happens is it's a real concern for the new Massachusetts state government after independence in 1776 about these continued efforts to control smallpox outbreaks in Boston. And so historians have made a pretty strong argument that the siege of Boston in part lasted as long as it did because there was a real fear of if the Continental forces were to actually invade and try and take Boston back, they might win Boston at the cost of spreading smallpox far and wide throughout New England and perhaps further. So there's even an epidemic history to the Revolution of Boston that I think has special sort of resonance to our conditions today. Well, I've gone on for a pretty long time and we only have 12 minutes left in class. So hopefully I didn't talk too much.
Not at all. That was really wonderful. And yeah, no, it tied together, like you said, so many of the themes that we've discussed already, relating to slavery, relating to the significance of that triangle trade. We talked about Mark Peterson's explanation of the triangle trade and how it shifted from that from the triangle that went to Spain, England, and Boston towards the Caribbean, right, to supply the Caribbean with goods locally from Massachusetts. So tying that into that this continues, right? He's focusing on what that we read was focusing on the 17th century, but this continues to power Boston's economy well into the 18th century, and then has these revolutionary, this importance in the revolutionary movement. Mm-hmm. And wonderful stuff about popular protest. I absolutely loved it. I have my own questions, but before I do students have any questions? Anybody want to chime in with any questions for Professor Schlereth? When was the Quartering Act put in place? Cole would like to know.
The Quartering Act was part of the larger, was part of the Townshend Acts. So the Townshend Acts were revenue raising, but there were also efforts. That's when they imposed that as well. So the Townshend Acts were a whole series of imperial reform efforts, and that was part of that, the Quartering Act as well.
Any other students with questions?
Which provokes a lot of conflict in the colonies as well. I think that's probably the thinking behind that question was, this was one of these turning points where there was new obligations to sort of house British regulars in Boston and New York as well. And so that creates protest because people were hostile to this. And the last thing I'll say as we get back to questions is, under the Townshend Acts, the courts that were created to enforce these were going to be housed in effectively admiralty courts, so maritime courts were going to be based in Boston. So Boston was going to become the center of enforcing this new policy, which many of the locals did not like.
Anybody else before I jump in with my own questions? Well, so I can't resist asking, and this comes out in the reading as well, but I can't resist interjecting your advisor's favorite term, especially when it came to, you know, the pandemic made me think of it, which is contingency, right? So, you know, I thought maybe you could explain this idea that which you really brought to light with the whole question of the pandemic, that there was no, you know, there was no sort of inevitability to the revolution, that a whole series of events had to like align perfectly in order for this to take place. That it was contingent on a variety of fairly, you know, random sort of factors. But before you answer that question, Professor Schlereth, we have a couple of questions in the chat. So I want to prioritize the student questions, which was Tobias. Toby is asking, was there any massive effect of the revolution on the native populations in the Northeast? Were they pushed out of certain areas, or were they enlisted for help? And Jacob also is asking a similar question about, a little bit earlier, but about the indigenous community's reaction to the Tea Party. So 2 questions about the indigenous populations. So maybe I want to prioritize the student questions. Yeah.
Sure. So I'll take the second question first. I don't know for sure how the indigenous community, or if the indigenous community responded to the Tea Party. I'm not certain about that. Actually, it's a good question. There might be a research project in this. In terms of the first question, so, you know, indigenous peoples were sort of, when the revolution begins, especially when the war itself begins, they find themselves in a very tricky situation, because in many cases, the indigenous people of the Northeast sort of relied pretty heavily on trade with the empire. And in fact, after the French and Indian War, Parliament had taken a fairly sympathetic stand in some ways toward indigenous people. There is some talk of effectively creating or reserving a large part of North America for indigenous people that would have been protected from white settlers. In the Massachusetts case in particular, so the point is they had to sort of choose which side they were on. Many of them tried to remain neutral and say, you know, this is a conflict between colonists and the king. This is irrelevant to us. That became very difficult because the revolution itself, the war itself, begins to move into Indian territory. And so in the Massachusetts case, the Stockbridge Indians who lived in central Mass, they lived in the town of Stockbridge, that's how they got the name, they actually sided with the Americans in this. And when the war was over, they thought they were going to get some sort of benefits from this, but in fact, the government of Massachusetts winds up pushing them out of their territory and taking land from them. Many, the Oneida, for example, in upstate New York, they allied with the Americans, whereas the rest of the Iroquois Confederacy supported the British. And the remaining Iroquois wound up actually, George Washington, as the commander of the Continental Army, sent one of his commanding generals, a guy named Sullivan, into upstate New York to basically forcibly remove many of the Iroquois in upstate New York. Washington became known as the town destroyer on the part of the upstate Iroquois. And so I think the answer to your question, Tobias, is basically the revolution for Northeastern indigenous people was a real kind of blow to their standing. Before the revolution, they preserved much of their territorial autonomy. Once the revolution comes to an end and Great Britain's empire is reduced to Canada effectively in North America, this really puts the indigenous people from New England southward in a really sort of weakened position. And that's when you see massive dispossession begin to take place afterwards. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that was great. No, that was very helpful. It was a really wonderful question and an important one. I like that. That the students in the class so far, they have gone very. We had actually Marty Blatt and Christine DeLucia also come, and so they're getting a good exposure to elements of Boston history that are often left out, like the indigenous history and slavery, and to have it tied into the revolution itself. These areas that are focused upon more is really, really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other questions before I redirect Professor Schlereth to my own? So then you can actually you can answer my question, which is, does the pandemic, does it sort of focus on the pandemic? Does this reinforce, David Hackett Fisher's sort of idea about the very contingent nature of the success of the revolution, contingent on a bunch of factors that were actually beyond the control of the revolutionaries themselves?
Yeah, I mean, so the idea, just to reiterate, the idea of contingency is that, there's nothing, that history is about a series of choices that individuals have to make, but they can only make choices within the sort of conditions available to them. And so, granted that the cannon that were posted in Dorchester Heights had to be hauled in from Western Massachusetts. So that delayed the siege in that regard. But yes, they could not have anticipated a smallpox outbreak. And because of that, that forced a new set of choices that had to be made. And so I think it is a great example of how I often tell, when I do my lectures on the American Revolution for my students, I often talk about what I call the unanticipated American Revolution. I think especially, just a bit about sort of, my university has a lot of, we have, I think 30% of our students are international students. And so many of my students come to this history not really knowing much about the revolution. And then my students that are from the United States often have this idea that from the moment that the English created colonists in North America, that independence in the United States were somehow inevitable and that this was going to happen. And that's just no one anticipated that at the time. And we know the history just isn't there. And so what I always tell my students is that we have to think about the revolution as the unanticipated American Revolution. And with this notion of this unanticipated notion is this idea of contingency. There's no talk of independence at all until 1776, really. So you've got a decade of protest in which people are making arguments for British liberty, not for American liberty, not for independence. And it's a series of choices that push them in that direction. In the colony of Virginia, for example, it's when the last royal governor, a guy named William Dunmore, actually offers freedom to any enslaved person who will flee a slave owner that's in rebellion or in protest to the crown. And so basically what happens is you have slaves flee to gain their freedom under Lord Dunmore. One of them was a guy named Ralph Henry. You may know who claimed ownership over Ralph Henry, Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry, who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Ralph Henry said, "Okay, I'll get my liberty." And he fled and found his freedom with the British. That act, Dunmore's proclamation, if Dunmore had not made that choice to offer freedom to the slaves of Virginia whose masters were in rebellion, it's possible many of these Virginians would have said, look, we have a much better protection within the empire. I'm not going to support what the Bostonians are doing in protesting. But by making that choice, that then precipitates a new set of consequences.
And been like Canada.
Yes, exactly. So you could have had Canada on the Chesapeake.
Yeah. No, I mean, that just it ties in absolutely absolutely perfectly to even to your book, to the book that you're working on, right, where plenty of people have said, "I'm out of here," right?
Yeah. Which has several chapters on Canada, by the way. It has.
Of course it does. Of course it does. You can travel down Loyalist Highway to do your research.
Yeah, no, it's remarkable. And, so, I mean, not to, Nova Scotia is an interesting example of this because Nova Scotia has a very sort of a long-standing Afro-Canadian population, and sort of the Black Canadians often they can trace their history to this revolutionary moment when they fled.
And their descendants are still there. There's still a significant community there.
Yeah.
So I do unfortunately have to leave it there. But before everybody drops off, they need to hear Professor Schlereth's trivia question for today.
Okay, so I posed the question. I'll do my best, Alex Trebek here, I guess.
Yes.
In what Massachusetts town did the crowd pummel a man with a live goose? So in what Massachusetts town did the crowd pummel a man with a live goose?
So we all remember the goose story. And we will continue to remember it. So the question is, what town did it take place in?
What town did it take place in? Yes.
Send me your correct answers. All right. Thank you, guys. Thanks, everybody. That was awesome. Thank you so much, Eric. And as you can see in the chat, I love when all the thanks roll in the chat. You get a lot. Look at all this chat love. Oh, there was somebody was foolish enough to write the right answer in the chat. What are you doing? Oh, no, it was sent to me privately. Oh, thankfully.
Well, thank you, everyone. This was great fun for me. I hope it was for you as well.
Yeah, it was awesome. Thanks. Next class is going to be all towering and feathering.
Yes.
Could you repeat the question one more time?
Yes. So the question is, I gave you an example of a tarring and feathering in which a man was pummeled by a live goose. What town did that take place in?
That's it. Well, we have to let them go, Eric. We can, of course, continue to chat.
Go all day.
The tarring and feathering, I was wondering, though, and everybody is free to go, by the way. Don't feel that, but you can stay to listen to this question, though. But was this taken from the religious wars of Europe in the 17th century? Is that where that practice comes from? I'm guessing that this is an English Civil War practice, or
yeah. So historians trace this back to sort of early modern English history, and it's kind of akin to things like riding people out on the rail, which was another way of. It was a form of supposed to be sort of humiliation and coercion. And I'm not sure if you know the English practice of riding people out on rails. But
no, I don't.
It was often actually
I'm envisioning something painful, though.
Oh yeah, it was directed toward often men.
That's where off the rails comes from? I always thought of a train track, like a train.
I think that might be a train thing, but riding the rail, like riding someone out on the rail, is you would actually forcibly sort of strap them onto a log and carry them out of town as a way of humiliation. And it was sometimes directed toward men who are, the latitude to abuse your wife was fairly broad in this period, but if you were an especially egregious offender of this, you might be ridden out on a rail. And the idea was a form of kind of public humiliation. And there's one famous example from the colonial period that I'm aware of where in the course of sort of tying this person onto the rail, they gouged open his thigh and they hit the major artery in his leg, and he bled to death after he did this. But yeah, tarring and feathering comes from these early modern English practices that are about sort of humiliating and also coercing effectively people to abide by community norms. There's a question.
There's actually a question in the chat about whether this relates to persecution of witches at all, or if it was used for punishment and persecution of witches.
It comes, I think, from the same kind of cultural practices of, communities policing their own, sort of having sort of community norms that are policed. These could be community political norms or community religious norms. And in the case of witchcraft, especially the sort of well-known New England context of the 1690s, the Massachusetts context, there were all sorts of religious mob justice is, I think, a good way to put it. If you're interested in witchcraft, Alexander, the story that mob justice reminds me of this. In 1787, in Philadelphia, when the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were debating this new frame of government, there was actually a witchcraft scare in Philadelphia. And there was a woman in Philadelphia who was accused of witchcraft. And the townspeople of Philadelphia stoned her in the streets of Philadelphia, blocks from where the Constitutional Convention was underway. And so the thing religious mob justice kind of brought this to mind, because the delegates to the Constitutional Convention knew about this, and they thought, what in the world, is there any prospect for this Constitution if the people that we are expecting to abide by this and the people who are going to govern themselves are in the streets stoning accused witches? And so, yes, there were actually
no. A Canadian will tell you the answer is no.
Yeah, I know. It's like, if only we could have been more like Upper Canada and Lower Canada, we could have, Which
Well,
that's the terms for the two before you had Ontario and Quebec, the British called them Upper and Lower Canada.
That's right. That's
Okay,
right.
it's Quebec, then Lower Canada, now Quebec again.
Yeah. And it ties in well, actually, to, one of the points that Jared Hardesty made last week was that, talking about sort of viewing slavery in context, one of the things he said was, or looking at essentially how labor worked in the 18th century, colonial Boston, that, this was a violent society. This was a society that considered, discipline and upbringing and shaping children and discipline of wives, every aspect of that society, discipline was achieved through violence. It's one of the points that, so this is like a graphic example. You want to run people out of town, you want to shame them.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, branding was a common practice. The Quakers had a practice of, if somebody was, and the Quakers were, it's a peaceful sort of pacifist, but you could have, branding with A for adultery on the face if you were a serial adulterer. I mean, so yeah, the idea was not just violence, but you give the evidence of past crimes by mutilating the body.
Yeah.
And the really graphic ones, when you read the slave codes of, say, South Carolina, for example, the colony of South Carolina introduces all sorts of brutal punishments for enslaved people for sort of any perceived kind of disobedience or the prospect of slave resistance was met with really brutal violence, and even more so in the Caribbean. But this was true. I mean, he's right. It was a violent era in which, you shamed people into behaving and you dealt with this through violence. And it was also a society of unfreedom. I mean, we think of sort of enslaved people and free people, but this was a spectrum of unfreedom in this society that people had.
Yeah, exactly. I love the tie-ins. That's perfect. Well, Eric, I should let you go. Get on with your day.
Let's brighten early here. It's only not even 9 o'clock.
Right?